I can't complain. I wasn't the only person who lost everything. Today, my guest on the podcast is Richard Ihetu. He was born in Amaigbo in 1929, and the world knew him as Dig Tiger. He was a famous boxer. He was twice the middleweight champion of the world, light heavyweight champion after that. The first world title fight ever fought on African soil was his. And I didn't know much about Dig Tiger. I'd heard his name, but I didn't know enough about the legacy of the man or his story and what he left after he passed on. And so, I went digging, I went doing my research, and that brings me down this path here to you today. But just before we get onto the podcast, I think it's important to share a little bit about how this is made, because I think it matters. I don't think it's fair or correct to superimpose emotion onto some of our heroes, especially when none is present. So everything factual that you hear is sourced, and you can check the show notes for my sources and for, where I gathered my research from. But the sentences themselves, the way he says them, that voice is mine. And so where the record is quiet, so am I, because this is a reconstruction, not so much a recording, of verbatim. So now that I've told you, I think it's only fair that we get on with the podcast. Today's episode is Dig Tiger. On with the podcast. We talk about life, we talk about culture, music, their successes, their failures, their regrets, and their legacies. They called me Tiger, and I didn't choose it, and I'll tell you exactly how it happened. Because it's a small story, but it's an honest one. I was young, still an amateur, fighting, the way a big, strong boy fights before anyone tells him how to fight better. And there was this Englishman watching, and I didn't know what he'd been drinking that afternoon. But he saw me jumping on a man that was twice my size, and he shouted it for everyone to hear, "A tiger! That's what he is, a tiger!" And I was already Dick, because that's what they called Richard in those days. And so the two names met each other in a stranger's mouth. And by the time I turned professional, I didn't even have a say in the matter anymore. The crowd had made me. I only had to grow into it. But my true name, the one my mother and father gave me, was Richard Ihetu. I was the champion of the world, twice over, in 2 weights, the first African to do it. And when it was finished, I stood in a great museum in New York, in a guard's uniform, watching over other men's treasures. Now, both of those men are me, and I can tell you how. Richard Ihetu, born on the 14th of August, 1929 in Amaigbo, Igbo country, in the east of what they were calling Nigeria then. Igbo, that word, it's everything that I did. The fighting, the crown, and the thing that cost me everything in the end runs back to being Igbo. But we'll get there. So my father wrestled, not for a living, more for honor, the way old men still did it in the village square, before I was even born into the world. So I didn't invent the fighting in my family. My father carried it before me. I only carried it somewhere he could never have imagined. His name was Ubuagu, a trader and a wrestler. And although I didn't understand it as a boy, he was not a man that was going to live to see me grown. My mother was Rebecca. And when money was thin, and money in those days for us, money was often thin, it was her hopes that I carried to market. To be honest, I didn't have a soft childhood. It was not very soft. Before I was old enough to do anything else, my work was fetching water and firewood. Every morning, I walked to the forest and back with the load on my head or on my shoulder. That was my duty, my routine, before boxing was even a thing. I went to the mission school, Holy Trinity in Amaigbo. They called me a bright boy. I was a hard worker. I finished standard 6, and then my father passed. I was a boy. I was 13. And when the man of a house goes, the house does not wait for the boy to grieve. My older brothers and I left our books together. There was no argument about it. It's simply what you do as a family to survive. We moved to another town. We moved to Aba. And there, before I sold a single bottle, I pushed a cart barefoot on the unpaved roads, delivering another man's goods to another man's shop. That was my first wage. Up and down, my own feet, and a cart that was not mine, full of things that were not mine either. So, my education ended when my father passed. And then my real school, what I consider schooling, began pushing that cart through Aba. By the time I was 17, in 1946, I had my own small trade. I sold bottles, empty bottles. I gathered them and I carried them to the warehouses. And I sold them for a few pennies. That was my trade. It was my capital, less than £1.25, and my mother's prayers. That was everything I had. Sometimes my brother and I went even further. We went down to Ogoni in the Delta. We bought monkeys, parrots, cats, and we would train them a little, and sell them on in the market. It was a strange trade, for a future champion. But there was no trade that was too strange as long as it fed the house. By then I was known, as a boy who could handle himself, short, strong boy. Whenever there was trouble, people knew I could handle myself. And I wasn't very tall, but I was broad. And it's street fights, they taught you a lesson that the classroom could never teach you. And there's a small thing that I remember, and it tells you more about me than, any of those titles ever will. In those days, there were taps in Aba where you fetch water from. And, because of the climate, those taps ran dry in the heat of the day. And then they only trickled, late at night. And so men would gather, tired, everybody short-tempered, and they'd be pushing and there'd be trouble. And I was already big, already strong. And I would have taken my water first and let everybody quarrel behind me. But instead, I made everybody stand in a line, I made everybody queue up. And that's who I was before there was even a tiger. I was a man who would rather bring order than throw a punch. So growing up, I had read about two, Americans, Joe Louis and Sugar Ray Robinson. The way a boy reads about men he could never imagine becoming. And that's where this idea got started. I didn't have a plan, but the story that I wanted for myself, none of that was written for me. And there were these English soldiers in the East, and the English, they loved their boxing, and they ran contests between clubs, and a big, strong Botticelli was noticed. There was a guy called Bobby Diamond. Anyway, I turned professional in 1952. I won the Nigerian middleweight title. In my own country, I was somebody, I was popular. But a man who is somebody at home begins to wonder what is missing in the wider world. So in 1955, I got on a ship, and Liverpool, England, man, the cold. It was cold in a way that the east of Nigeria had never taught me. And when I arrived, I only had a t-shirt and trousers. I'll be honest with you, the first years in Liverpool were poor. I managed to fight, but I was on the small parts of the card for really small money, under management that didn't do me any favors. And there were nights that I lost that I really should have won. But eventually, I was a big deal in Liverpool in those days. Then in 1957, they put me, in against a favorite from London, Terry Downs. Everybody expected me to lose. But I stopped him in 6 rounds. Then after that, new hands took over everything, my training. They corrected the errors in my style. And I won. I won 17 of my next 19 fights. I took the British Empire title. I was no longer just a small card fighter, I'd become, coming up in the world of boxing. But let me tell you about this night in Canada, because a champion should tell you about his robberies as well as his wins. In Edmonton, I fought this local man, Wilf Greaves, for my Empire belt. I beat him, no doubt. I beat him. Everyone in the hall saw me beat him. First they called it a draw, and then they recounted the cards again, and somehow the count gave my fight, to him. I was very honest in my dealings. I learned very slowly that not everyone else will be honest in theirs, and that, this far side of the world is probably where the least honest ones in the world were. You want to know what I'm proudest of? Well, okay, so America, right? 1959. And on the 23rd of October, actually in 1962, 23rd of October, San Francisco. I fought this Gene Fulmer for the championship of the world. Can you imagine? And 15 rounds, and at the end of it, I was the middleweight champion of the world. The first Nigerian ever to hold such a thing. But if I'm honest with you, that's not the night I'm the most proudest of. I'll tell you the one that is. The next year, they let me defend that title at home. 10th of August, 1963. It was in Liberty Stadium in Ibadan.
On my left, from the United States of America, the challenger, King Fulmer. And on my right, from Nigeria, the reigning middleweight champion of the world, King Tiger.
Fulmer came to Nigeria, to African soil, and then I beat him again, and I stopped him this time.
The fight has been stopped. The fight has been stopped. The Tiger, the whole place is in pandemonium.
Before then, no world championship had ever been fought on African ground, not once. My people watched their own son do it in their own country with their own eyes. Fulmer said afterward that, and these are his words, not mine, that I beat him so badly that his own mother and father could have been the judges and he still could not have won a round. That is the night. And if you take one image of me, take that one, not the guard's uniform, take this one on African soil. Now I want you to understand the kind of fighter that I was. So I'll name my rivals because a man is measured by the people he stood across from. Joey Giardello and I fought. We fought like 4 times. 4. Everyone went the full distance. We passed the championship back and forth between us. And when it was done, we respected each other as men. He said I didn't have to give him his chance, but I did. That was true, I did. I lost the middleweight crown, but instead of fade and, go quietly, I went up in weight. I was 37 years old. Which is kind of old, for a boxer. I fought Jose Terres for the light heavyweight championship of the world, and I won it. 2 divisions. I was the first African to hold undisputed titles in 2 weights. And then, because every fighter, the story ends the same way. You stay too long. There was a younger, harder man, Bob Foster. That man could hit. He caught me with a left hook. I was nearly 40. It was the only time in my whole life when a man knocked me from my feet and I didn't rise up in time. Once in a whole life of fighting, and I'm not complaining about it, I finally understand, the position that I've put other men in. But a man who fights long enough, he meets the punch with his name on it. And they asked me once after a hard fight, how long before you fight again? The reporters after the match, they come up to you. And, I said to them, I have no other job. Tomorrow, I'm ready. And I wasn't being brave, it wasn't bravado. It was just maths. That was really the only trade, that I had ever learned. Now, by this time, I had met Abigail Obuji. And in 1959, we got married. We had 8 children. Here's the thing that people found hard to understand about me. That a man who, did the things that I did in the ring could, outside of it, be a quiet man. Because I didn't shout. I didn't boast for the cameras. I didn't make a show or circus of myself in the way that, the trade was starting to demand of boxers. I really wasn't for that kind of thing. At home, I was the opposite of the ring. I enjoyed making my children laugh. I was very liberal, very generous, very funny. I like to just, play around with the kids, behave like an animal, that kind of thing. I loved making my children laugh. But, I'll tell you the part that they leave out of my story when they tell it. They like the beginning, the barefoot boy, the cart, the bottles, and they like the end, the uniform, the museum, the poor man dying young. Those two make a great story, the rise and the fall. But there was a middle, and in the middle, I was a businessman. Over 15 years of fighting, I earned something near $500,000. That's what my manager counted up at the end, and that was the figure that he came up with. Now, a fighter's money is a strange kind of money. It comes in hard, all at once, and it stops without warning. Every man in the trade knows someone who had it and then didn't. And so I didn't keep it in my hands. I put it into the things that stand up. I bought 7 apartment houses, not in America, at home in Nigeria. And in Aba, the same Aba where I had pushed another man's car along unpaved roads, I built a house, me. A big one, with air conditioning. The Americans who came to see it said it looked like an old mansion from New Orleans. On the ground floor of that house, I ran a real estate office. And beside it, my wife, Abigail, she ran her own cosmetic shop. We were 2 businesses under one roof, and that roof was ours. There was even a Mercedes, and I had a chauffeur. I had a man to drive my Mercedes. But this is the part that, I'll tell you. All of this was in Nigeria. I was in New York, because that's where the fights were, in New York. And in New York, I lived in a small apartment in Brooklyn on Alabama Avenue. There's one man, a few rooms, very quietly. Because the money was not for me. I sent it home, almost all of it, to Abigail and to the children, and to the house in Aba. To me, that is what a man from where I come from does. You don't spend it where you are, you send it to where you're from. You live small in a rich country so that the people in the poor one can live properly. And I didn't do it to be admired. I did it because I had been the boy in that house when the money stopped. So I knew exactly what I was buying. I was buying the certainty that my children will never gather bottles. So that was the plan. 7 houses, a shop, an office, and a family who would never be hungry. The plan did not survive what came next. In 1967, my country broke in 2, and the East, my East, Igbo land, declared itself Biafra. And they killed my people in their thousands, and their hundreds of thousands. Children, most of all, starved in a war where hunger was used as a weapon. I was famous. I was in America, safe, with a portfolio and a title. No one would have blamed me for staying quiet and keeping what I had. But I didn't keep quiet. I had been honored by the Queen of England, made a member of the Order of the British Empire. And the British government was sending the arms that were killing my people. So I called the newspaper men together before a fight in New Jersey. And I told them plainly, I called you to let you know that I am relinquishing this member of the most excellent order of the British Empire that I won in London. Because I cannot wear this around my waist while the British government is supplying ammunition to kill my people in Biafra. And the next morning I put it in the post, back to London with a note. And I know the words of the note because I chose them carefully. I am returning it because every time I look at it, I think of the millions of men, women and children who died and are still dying in Biafra because of the arms and the ammunition the British government is sending to Nigeria and its continued moral support of this genocidal war against my people. I marched into the ring after that under the rising sun of Biafra, not the flag of Nigeria. I gave speeches, I gave money, I served as a lieutenant, as training men. The Nigerians tried for a time to pretend as if nothing had changed. In America, at ringside, they will still announce me as Dig Tiger of Nigeria. Back home, the newspaper said nothing about what I'd done. And I told an American reporter in a hotel room in New York exactly what I thought of that. I said, what do they mean, Dig Tiger of Nigeria? Yet they would kill me. And it wasn't just words. I had to physically evade Nigerian forces. First I had to go through Cameroon borders, and then later, if I got lucky, by airlift. But, I want you to realize something. I didn't do the loudest thing that a fighter could do, for my people. I did the most expensive one. I gave away the honor. And I gave away the fortune, quietly. The same way that I made men queue up at the tap. That was my mindset. Biafra lost. In 1970, it was over. And the 7 houses were gone, the office, Abigail's shop, the big house in Aba with the air conditioning, all of it. But I want to be exact about this because the war took it is not quite the truth, and I would rather you had the truth. Yes, some of it the war took, and some of it I spent on my people while they were starving. I would finish a fight in the garden with the mark still on my face and get on a plane and buy what could be bought and send it to where it was needed. A man's fortune can be taken from him, and mine was partly taken, partly given, and my own country, Nigeria, banned me for the side that I had chosen. And they asked me about it afterwards, about losing everything, and I said what I still believe. I said, I can't complain. I wasn't the only person who lost everything. So I went back to New York, to the only work that I could find. I was a security guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Me, a world champion, twice. In a uniform, minding the door of a beautiful building full of treasures that were not mine. But look, I'm not going to perform bitterness for you. Did I lose things? Yes. But a man who cannot lose things for what he believes never believed in anything. And then the pain came while I was on duty. It was a sudden spasm deep in my side. And the next thing is they took me from the museum floor straight to the hospital. I was still in uniform. It was liver cancer. And it was terminal. That's what they said. At this point, I had not set foot in my country in over 3 years. I wanted to go home. But a banned man doesn't simply go home. I had to ask and wait and be given assurances that if I came, nothing would happen to me. And in July of 1971, they let me come home. So I was 42 years old, and it hadn't been long since I retired from boxing when it happened, on the 14th of December, 1971. Years later, they say that my grave fell to ruin, cracked stones, weeds. They say you wouldn't even know that a champion of the world lay there. It's like the wider world remembered me better than my own did. I was the first African they ever put in the International Boxing Hall of Fame. But at home, for a long time, my name was quietly spoken because of the flag that I chose. They forgave the fighters slowly because they could not forgive the Biafran quickly. So, what should they say of me? They can't say that I was the hardest man. There's always a harder man. It took Bob Foster 4 rounds to teach me that short lesson. But I hope that they say this instead, that I came from nothing, from dusty bottles in Aba, but I climbed as high as the world goes. And when my people were dying, I didn't measure what it would cost me. I gave the honor back. I gave the money back. And I kept the only thing that no government can take from a man, the knowledge of whose side I was on. And so that is my advice. If a fighter is allowed to give any advice, find the people who are yours. And when the day comes that keeping them costs you everything, pay it. So that was Richard Ihetu, Dick Tiger, and such a fascinating story. I hope you found it as fascinating as I found parts of his life myself. But I want to tell you the thing that actually made me make this episode. Years later, when the BBC interviewed his son, years later, he was grown, a barrister, he said something, and he said, when you lose your dad, especially when you're young, it kind of feels like you're on your own. And that's partly why this show exists is, when I lost my father, I kind of felt the same thing for a while. I had questions that I could no longer ask my father, who I wished I'd spoken to. And just like my dad, Dick Tiger is someone who I would have loved to have a sit down with and ask some of these questions. And I did the same thing like I would with any living guest. I sat them down and I asked him, what are you proudest of? What do you regret? What was your childhood like? What were you listening to? Growing up, what do you want said about you when you've gone? Obviously, I can't know if I got those right, but I've been honest in my research and trying to get answers to some of these questions. But somebody should have asked him, you know. Somebody probably did, but it wasn't recorded. So here you are, and here we have it. So this is what I'll say to you is, if you take away one thing from this, is there's probably somebody in your family now who knows things that nobody has written down anywhere. I think you should go and ask them. Ask them the boring questions. Where were you born? What did your mother do when, you know, they were young or before you were born? What did your father do? What were you listening to at 17, 21? What was it like for you meeting your husband or wife? And, you know, you should ask them before it becomes a research project. And, you know, yeah, I think it's a key thing. And it's really important for us to do those things. So thank you again for listening. And it's been a pleasure for me to bring these lives and legacies back to your hearing. So, well, next time, I think I'll keep it a surprise for now, but on the next episode, I have another fascinating character from antiquity who I got the privilege to sit down with and have a conversation with. So until the next time, thank you for listening. My name is Mide. Bye.